This is the first lesson in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Classical Arithmetic program. In this first lesson, what I'd like to do is to provide a simple introduction not only to classical arithmetic, but all four arts of classical mathematics, which hopefully you'll be studying with us in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. The first thing to know is that classical arithmetic, along with the other three mathematical arts, are studies of quantity. And it's important for us to understand what quantity is, because it's a little bit tricky. Because what we talk about in modern math classes is not what we're talking about in classical math classes. So let's take a minute to talk about what quantity is when we talk about quantity in mathematics. In his work on classical reasoning, Aristotle wants to establish rational philosophy, and what that means is the wisdom that understands and orders our thoughts. So in classical reasoning, Aristotle's concerned with our thoughts, with words and ideas that exist in our minds. And to become wise, the first science that we need to master for wisdom is reasoning, because we have to learn how to order our own thoughts. What Aristotle does in classical reasoning, which I hope that you study in Classical Reasoning 1, is that he tells us that when we think of things, anything we think about is called a subject. And then a predicate is whatever we say or think about that subject. So we have subjects and predicates. And when we look at a certain subject, let's say I look out the window and I see a tree, an apple tree. I'll say an apple tree. And I turn away from the window and I have an image in my mind called an idea. I have an idea that's a sign of that object, of that tree. Then I can ask a series of questions to talk about that tree. The first question I can ask is a substance question, a question of substance. What is that? And the answer is, that is an apple tree. And what I've said about the object is the substance of the object. The second thing that I can think or say about that object is how many or how much. And I can say things like, it is one apple tree. Or I can say, it is a large apple tree. Or an old apple tree. I can talk about different quantities that may be associated with that object. So quantity is the second thing that I can say about an object. And then Aristotle goes on to teach that there are 10 things that we can say about any object. We can't say all 10 of them about any object, but there are 10 categories of things that we can say or think, about an object. The first is substance. What is it? The second is quantity. How many or how much? And when we get to quantity, once we learn that quantity is one of the things, one of the categories of things that we can say or think about objects, in order to speak truly, we need to study quantity so that we understand what it is, what different quantities are, so that we can speak about things rightly as regards quantity. Okay, so in classical mathematics, we're studying quantity because quantity is part of classical reasoning. It's one of the 10 categories, one of the 10 classes of things that we can think or say about objects or subjects. So we want to investigate and understand what quantity is. We want to know if there are different kinds of quantity. We want to know what the different quantities are so that we can then speak truly about different subjects. So the ancient philosophers investigated this. We don't have to do the work of discovering these things because by God's grace we live in a time when this philosophy has already been established by gifted, hard-working men who worked and studied to establish the philosophy of quantity. When they investigated quantity, they learned that quantities could be divided into two general kinds or species. And the two kinds of quantities are multitudes. You can see it here marked with the Roman numeral 1. Multitudes and magnitudes. So the ancient philosophers found that quantities can be divided into two species or classes, multitudes and magnitudes. A multitude is a quantity that actually contains a collection of separate individual things called units. A multitude is a collection of units, and those units can be anything. If I look out into the field, I can see a herd of sheep. The herd is a multitude. The sheep are the units. If I were to pull a pocket load of change out of my pocket and throw it on the table, there would be a multitude of coins. And if we said 1 cent is the unit, we would have a multitude of cents, a collection of units there in that money. These are multitudes. That's one kind of quantity. The second kind of quantity is a magnitude. When we talk about a magnitude, we're talking about only one thing, one body. But a magnitude is able to change in size. It can become greater or less. So a magnitude and quantities that are magnitudes are quantities that relate to individual bodies, such as size, as I said. So these are two different kinds of quantities, multitudes and magnitudes. Now, as the ancient philosophers continued studying quantity, what they found was when they looked at multitudes, they could find two different kinds of multitudes. Multitude could be divided into two different classes. The first class were absolute multitudes. And absolute multitudes are multitudes where the number is referred to unity. Okay, where the quantity or the number of the multitude is referred to a unit, a single unit. So for example, if I have 7 cents, 7 cents is an absolute multitude. It's referred to a single unit, the cent. 7 cents is an absolute multitude. The second kind of multitude was relative. I could express a quantity, I could express the value of a multitude without referring to unity. I could say, for example, that this is half of that. Okay, this herd of sheep at this farm is double the herd of sheep at that farm. It's 2 to 1. There's a ratio between them. I could say, for every 2 sheep in this herd, there are 3 sheep in this herd, and the ratio is 3 to 2. This is a relative multitude. Okay, that's the second kind of multitude. As for magnitudes, when the ancients looked at magnitudes, they found the same thing. They found that there's a division of magnitude into 2 different kinds. The first kind were bodies that were at rest. Bodies at rest. And an example of a body at rest is the earth. Okay? The earth is a body at rest. The second kind of magnitude are bodies that are in motion and are measured in motion. An example of bodies that are in motion, that are measured in motion, are the heavenly objects. okay? The stars and the planets, the sun and the moon moving through the sky. Their bodies in motion. When they finished with this investigation, they found that there are two kinds of multitudes and two kinds of magnitudes, making a total of 4 different kinds of quantities. So there are 4 kinds of quantities. Now, if we want to study absolute multitudes, we need an art that studies absolute multitudes. And that art is the art called arithmetic. Arithmetic is the art of absolute multitudes. If we want to study relative multitudes, we need a different study. And you may be surprised to learn that this in the ancient world was called music. And don't get that confused with a modern music class. If you go and study piano or violin or some other instrument, you go and what you learn is just practically how to play that instrument. You may learn how to read music, but you learn how to practically play an instrument. Okay? That's not what we mean when we talk about classical music. Classical music is a philosophical study that tries to understand the order of relative multitudes. Now, the reason why it's associated with music is because a lot of the art of the study of relative multitudes was discovered through the study of musical instruments. For example, the philosopher Pythagoras, he studied harmony in musical instruments. He wanted to know if we had 2 strings, for example, on an instrument, or if we had 5 strings and they were of different lengths, he found that if he plucked 2 of the strings, the sound of the 2 strings together would make an unpleasant sound. But if he plucked 2 different strings, the sound that they made together was pleasant. This was called harmony. He wanted to understand, what is it about these 2 sounds that causes that sound to be pleasant that they make together? And so as he studied that, he found that the relationships of the lengths of the strings in the numbers of them, the relationships of those numbers was responsible for whether the sounds were pleasing to the ear and harmonious or whether they were unpleasant. All right, so Pythagoras established the art of relative multitudes primarily through the examination of the sounds of music. And that's why music is associated with the study of relative multitudes. So we have 2 classical mathematical arts. Arithmetic, which is the study of the first kind of multitudes, and classical music, which is the study of the second kind of multitudes. Then, as for the investigation of magnitudes, those that were at rest were studied through the example of the earth. And so the name of the art of the study of magnitudes at rest was called geometry, which means the measurement of the earth. And lastly, the art where we study magnitudes in motion was called astronomy, because it was a study of the rules of the numerical relationships between the different heavenly bodies, the ratios and relationships between them, their sizes, their movements, and how they relate to one another, the objects in motion. So we end up with 4 arts in classical mathematics: classical arithmetic, classical music, classical geometry, and classical astronomy. And that's where the 4 classical mathematical arts come from. Now, you may need to review this video to see that explanation again, because it's very important, and I want to make sure you understand that. These 4 arts are actually very simple to understand if you understand the philosophy that leads to these four arts. In this course, we're studying classical arithmetic. So we're studying the first art of the classical mathematical system, and we're going to be studying absolute multitudes. Now, I want to say one more thing. You see this word up here, quadrivium. This word quadrivium is a name that's given to these four ancient mathematical arts. So anytime you see the quadrivium, that word quadrivium, it's referring to the four classical mathematical sciences. Okay? Very simple to understand. Now, in classical arithmetic, we're studying philosophical ideas. All right? That's what's different between classical mathematics and modern mathematics. In a modern math class, we're not interested in philosophy. We're trying to learn how to calculate things that we need to calculate either in everyday life or in a future career that we're hoping to work in. Modern mathematics are just concerned with practical things. We can't allow ourselves to be limited in our study to practical things because there are bigger issues in life. There are bigger issues in life than where are you going to work or how much money are you going to make. There are bigger questions to answer in life, and we need to study philosophy so that we can be wise. Mathematics is one of the subjects of the ancient curriculum, 4 of the 7 classical liberal arts, which are considered the starting place for the pursuit of wisdom, which is called philosophy. That's what we're studying in classical arithmetic. Now, in your first lesson, what the author of this textbook seeks to do for you is explain to you the order and relationship between these 4 mathematical arts. Okay, so here we are. Let's say you're 15 years old and you want to study classical mathematics. The first question is, where do we begin? Where should we start in the study of classical mathematics? And the author here explains that the first mathematical art in order is arithmetic. Okay, so classical arithmetic is where we'll start our study of classical mathematics. And he gives reasons why arithmetic must come first. First of all, the ideas in arithmetic must be understood so that we can think and speak about these other mathematical arts. For example, and these are examples he gives in the lesson. In geometry, if we say that a triangle has 3 sides, we're assuming that we've already established what the meaning of the number 3 is. So arithmetic must come before geometry because we use the ideas of absolute multitudes to communicate ideas of magnitudes at rest. So arithmetic must come before geometry. The same thing is true of music. In order to speak of music and relationships between numbers, we must already know the doctrine of simple or absolute numbers. And so music also comes after arithmetic. And then lastly, since astronomy speaks of objects in motion, and in order to speak of objects in motion, we must already understand objects that are at rest, because objects that are at rest are in a simpler state than objects that are in motion. Therefore, geometry must come before astronomy. And he gives more proofs for this order to convince and make it clear that arithmetic is in fact the first of the arts of the quadrivium, and that astronomy is the last of the arts of the quadrivium. And so as a student, where do we begin? We begin with arithmetic, classical arithmetic. Now, it's obvious that there's not a whole lot of arithmetic that needs to be understood before we can begin the study of music or of geometry. So you don't need to wait until you've completed the entire study of classical arithmetic before you get started in classical geometry or even in classical music. But you must wait to study classical astronomy until you've had a chance to study geometry. Classical astronomy, we'll also find, relates to classical music because there are relationships between different aspects of the objects in the heavens, like their orbits and things like that. There are different ratios, and that begins to bring us into ideas that come from relative multitudes, which is the study of music. So these four arts are all related, but there's an order to them, from the first and simplest, arithmetic, to the last and most complex, which is astronomy. But if I was to number these, I've numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, but it would really be more appropriate to number them as 1, 2, 2, 4, because geometry and music both can be started after you've studied classical arithmetic. Okay, so as you study this first lesson, I want you to make sure you learn the proofs that the author gives to demonstrate that this order is in fact true. And those things will be required of your lesson assessment. But I also want you to understand the philosophical ideas that I've introduced in this lesson. And I want you to see that if you're also studying classical reasoning in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you're going to understand that all of your studies in classical mathematics serve your study of classical reasoning. Okay? So it's all part of one system of the pursuit of wisdom. That's what the classical liberal arts are. So that's it for lesson 1 of Classical Arithmetic 1. If there are any questions you have from your lesson, it may take a little bit of work, but that's your job as a student. My job as the teacher is not to make things so easy that you depend upon me, because I can't do that for every lesson that you're going to have to learn. What I want to do is introduce you to the ideas to help you avoid mistakes in your studies, to try to prevent confusion that can be avoided by a little bit of help from a more experienced student, which is all that a teacher is. But you need, as a student, to take responsibility for your own learning and make the content of this art your own by studying it, memorizing it, mastering it, reviewing it constantly until you can walk away from your book and walk away from your lessons and take that art, take that wisdom with you and use it wherever you go. That's the goal of studies. Not to collect books, not to build a library, not to save web pages or print out lessons and have big piles of lessons. All of that is useless if the wisdom in those books and in those lessons doesn't become a part of your own soul that you bring with you wherever you go. That's the purpose of studies. You can see me teaching. I don't have notes in front of me. I don't have, anyone telling me what to say. I wrote this outline off the top of my head before I started the video camera. I can walk into a room. Anywhere I go, I can talk about these things and enjoy the benefits that they offer me because I've done the work of a student. And I want you to do that same work, because you'll see in life all of these subjects are going to be helpful at some time. They may not be helpful when you're 15 years old, when you're living at home, when dad is paying the bills and mom takes care of you. You may not need to know these things. You may not need to know these things to go and get a job at a local restaurant or a store. You may not need to know these things to be a member of the Catholic Church and go through ordinary Catholic life. But what we're studying for is ultimately a right knowledge of God and a right understanding of God's will, because at some points in our lives, we're going to face crucial challenges and questions that we will only be able to answer correctly if we've prepared for them. And this is part of that preparation. We read in the Bible warnings that we should be sober and vigilant, because we're told your enemy, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And the way that he devours us and defeats us is through temptations. And most of the temptations that the devil presents to us are simply false arguments that deceive us, that take advantage of our weaknesses. And if we're not trained to understand the truth and to discern good from bad arguments, and if we don't understand true philosophy, we leave ourselves vulnerable to those attacks. So this is a central part of your Catholic life. This is why the saints and doctors of the Church, if you study their lives with good biographies that get beyond just the simple basic details of their life, but get back into their education, what they taught, where they studied, what they studied, you'll find that the saints and doctors of the Church studied these things and used this wisdom in their own Catholic life. And that's one of the things that contributed to their holiness and wisdom. I'm not saying that human philosophy can make us perfect. We need God's grace, and that's pursued in other ways, but God has given us the faculty of reason, and it's our responsibility to live virtuously and develop and exercise the gifts that God has given us, or we're not worthy of other gifts that God can give to us. So realize the importance of these studies. Understand that the study of classical mathematics is a part of the study of classical reasoning and the bigger picture of philosophy, or the study of wisdom. I hope that's a helpful introduction to classical arithmetic and to classical mathematics in general. Get to work in your lesson. Follow the instructions. You'll see there are some notes in the lesson that I've added to try and make things easier for you. But if there's anything in your lesson that you struggle with, it's your job to reach out and contact me for assistance. I can help you and I will help you, but it's your job to make the effort to study, to reach out and ask for help when you're struggling, and then to complete your assessments, to try to do your work as perfectly as possible. And in the CLA, we reward you with points to try to encourage that excellent work and assessment. And so you have some motivation in just being able to earn points and compete with other students on the leaderboard and try to challenge one another to become great and wise Catholic students, because the world needs wise and great Catholic students. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.